This is the Sydney World Pride Human Rights Conference, held over 3 days at the International Convention Centre on Gadigal land in Sydney. Bringing together a veritable panoply of religious diversity, this session gave the conference a perspective on the experiences of LGBTQIA+ people of faith.
Thanks, Fran, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ro Allen. I use they, them pronouns, and today I'm wearing a blue suit and a white shirt. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation and pay my deepest respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people here today or online. As the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner, I'm so proud to work alongside a government working on treaty with Aboriginal people. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So as Fran said, I'm going to share a little bit about my faith journey today, which includes references to so-called conversion practices. So if this is a shared experience for you, I'd like to remind you of the supports that World Pride Conference has put in place for us. I grew up in the Uniting Church in Australia, arguably one of the most progressive Christian churches in the country. It was formed not long after I was born, and it had embraced a national discussion about faith and sexuality in its very early years. Even so, some of my earliest memories of teachings from the pulpit was that I was broken and that I needed healing. When I was 15, I went into a really dark space. I fell in with an evangelical so-called conversion movement, which promised me that healing. In reality, of course, it was a place of false promises, and it left me with deep self-loathing. I owe my life to the Reverend Dorothy McRae McMahon. Many of you might know, a Sydney-based Uniting, yeah, she needs a clap. A Uniting Church minister. She saw me before I even saw myself. And she taught me that it wasn't a choice between my sexuality and my spirituality. So I stayed in the Uniting Church and I found other LGBTIQ advocates like myself and people of faith, and together we formed a national network and we advocated for LGBTIQ+ inclusion in the church. I candidated for ministry and was accepted as an openly LGBTIQA+ person. It was my first brush with the national media spotlight, and I have to tell you, it was fairly bruising. And I wondered if the church was really ready for me. Or in fact, was I ready for the restrictions that I thought it could place on me? And so for the next 15 years, I fulfilled my vocation through the community services arm of the Uniting Church, and I grabbed every opportunity to create better support systems for queer young people. And I was a member of 4 government LGBTIQ ministerial advisory councils which worked on reform during those years. So by 2015, there was a supportive government in Victoria. The first Minister for Equality was appointed by then, and when the first Commissioner for originally Gender and Sexuality and later renamed LGBTIQ Commissioner was established, I was so proud to take up the appointment. Together we were able to build a really robust LGBTIQ+ sector and the systems to support the progressive LGBTIQA+ law reform. There were many difficult conversations along the way that were informed by my faith journey. I met on a number of occasions with the Victorian director of the Australian Christian Lobby branch, a deeply conservative coalition of churches in Australia. We had a cup of tea, we broke bread. In fact, we shared a muffin. At those times, I dug deep into a place I call the well of graciousness. I fundamentally believe that people can shift and change. But I also know how hard it was for me to shift and change my thinking about my faith and my sexuality. So I often go to the well, have a big drink, and think about Dorothy's advice back then. And she said, revolutionary patience, Ro, revolutionary patience. Because I believe when you can provide a safe place for that dialogue, you can see change, real change. They may not change their beliefs about us, however, they may not campaign so hard against us. In my current role as Victorian Human Rights Commissioner, I'm now custodian for 4 pieces of legislation: the Equal Opportunity Act, the Charter of Human Rights, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, and most recently, the 2021 Change and Suppression Conversion Practice Prohibition Act. The purpose of that Act is to denounce and prohibit change and suppression practices and to establish a civil response scheme within the Commission. An education function is actually embedded in the Act. I'm so proud of that. Oh yeah, thanks. This has been deeply informed by the survivors, and I want to acknowledge that it builds on the amazing work of other countries and indeed other states in Australia that have gone before us. So Anna Brown from the Equality Australia says this legislation is world's best practice. I'll take that. Thanks, Anna. And you can find a full copy of the Act on the QR code on the screen behind me, or visit the Australian Council of Human Rights Authorities activation next door. We'd love to see you. This legislation is a gift to my 15-year-old self. It's a gift to my queer daughter, who actually turned 15 on Tuesday. And it's a gift to everybody who has faced a choice between faith and identity. I'm so proud of the wording in this Act. It's intentional and it is clear, and I quote, "All people, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, feel welcome in Victoria, are able to live authentically and with pride." And most healing for me, it goes on to say, a person's sexual orientation and gender identity is not broken. Amen to that. Thank you.
I greet you with the universal greetings of peace. May the peace and blessings of our Creator and Sustainer be upon all of us. I was raised in a Muslim conservative community in Cape Town, South Africa, and I knew that I was attracted to the same sex ever since I became sexually aware. That was around the age of 5 years old. I think I started early. Growing up, there were no support structures in place, and I honestly thought that I was the only gay in the village. My house was a stone's throw away from the mosque in which my mother was teaching, and my Muslim school, which was run by my grandfather, who was the Imam of our community, was right next to my house. So Islam was, and it remains, intrinsic to me, as is my queer identity. I never imagined that at some point I would be forced to choose between the two. My entire teenage life was living in hiding, assuming an ultra-orthodox and religious persona to camouflage my queerness. Since I heard preached from the mosque's pulpit that all Muslim schools of thought agrees that homosexuals should be killed, they only differ in the style of execution. I couldn't understand why a merciful and compassionate God, which my grandfather always preached about, would punish me for something that I didn't choose. And why would God lay such a big burden on me greater than what I could bear? And this question led me to study Islam in Pakistan because I needed to seek the answers for myself. And at the age of 21, I left for Karachi during the height of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So my life up to that point was filled with stories of oppression, both social and religious. And later I found out that I was actually studying at a Salafi institution that promoted the strictest form of adherence to Islam, which further drove me into the closet. I started to question my sexuality, feared the wrath of God, and sought marriage with a woman in the hope that I could be straight and earn the favor of God. I tried hard to be a husband. I didn't have much sex with her, but I managed to father 3 children. I guess I was either prolific or 3 times lucky. But I couldn't keep up with the double life, and 6 years later, on my return to South Africa, I got divorced. I decided to spend time in seclusion on a friend's farm in a room next to the horse's stable. I was willing to live anywhere away from everyone just to find myself again. Because I've lost my identity at the time. I questioned my faith, I was angry at God, and I resolved to fast until I die or until God gives me a sign. My fast lasted for 80 days consecutively, and closer to the time I came to the end of the fast, I became clearer in my thoughts that God is not homophobic. My Muslim community was. That up to that point, my challenges were only hidden blessings. God created me, but she wasn't done with me yet. I was being shaped into a spiritual contract to live as an example of how we can embrace our identities as queer and as people of faith. I made peace with God, but I still maintained that his admin lacked a bit of communication skills. But in due time, I also embraced the fact that God works in mysterious ways and in his own time. So nothing was going to stop me now. My need to be authentic with God and the world was greater than my fear to die. So in 1998, I came out publicly as the world's first openly gay Imam. At the time, thank you. At the time, I was teaching at a fairly progressive mosque in Cape Town, but I was forced to resign even though I was considered as one of the best teachers that they've ever had. And then 16 years later, in an Eid sermon, the Imam of the mosque publicly apologized, saying that 16 years ago, we unfairly dismissed one of our gay teachers, and then we didn't have the tools to deal with homosexuality, but now perhaps it's time for the Muslim community to address their inherent homophobia. So you see, spiritual activism does not have to be confrontational. All we need is a willingness to boldly and authentically express who we are, and in a confrontational manner, compassionately engaging our communities and enlightening them. So in the first few months after coming out, I started a support group for queer Muslims to share their painful narratives and to give support to one another. This marked the start of my spiritual activism under the banner of an organization called the Inner Circle at a time. And in 2007, my first documentary, A Jihad for Love, was released, and at the same time, a fatwa, a religious judgment by a local Muslim judicial council stating that I was an apostate, I was casted out of the fold of Islam, and that I would not be buried in a Muslim graveyard. Muslims were asked to boycott the documentary, and the statement was read out in all the 300 mosques in Cape Town during a Friday sermon. Little did the Muslim Judicial Council know that they were inadvertently advertising for the documentary, to the extent that the night of the premiere, the cinema was jam-packed, and even after an attempt to purchase most of the tickets to prevent people from viewing it. And at the same time, I was also disowned by my mother's side of the family, and I was denied access to my kids in the fear that I would corrupt their minds, which only made them more curious as to why the world hated their father so much. They had their own struggles with their identity as being the children of the gay Imam. But the experience has resulted in an authentic love relationship between a gay father and his children. And to quote my daughter, she says, "For me, it was as if my father was always in a constant war, which I want to help him win." Last year, July, my latest documentary, The Radical, was released, in which I was asked the question, "Do you want to change Islam?" I said boldly, yes. I cannot change the Quran or the fundamental principles of my faith, but I can certainly bring my community back to the intrinsic values that our Prophet has left us with, and homophobia is certainly not one of them. Today, I can only be grateful for my experiences that have shaped me in becoming who I am today. Being queer and Muslim is no longer a contradiction. I am simply just an expression of divine intention. Today, I teach Muslims that the heart is not big enough to contain both faith and fear, so choose. In embracing both our spiritual and our sexual identities, it would be a futile exercise to try and carve a place for ourselves in organized Islam. Neither will we find God in a mosque or between the pages of the Quran. Rather, God and the relationship that we have with God is a personal one discovered and enhanced through the embracing of our painful narratives and how we navigate the seemingly contrasting phenomena of being queer and a person of faith. No one has the monopoly over faith, so it is our responsibility as a queer people to reinterpret our faith through the lens of our own queer realities and not that of patriarchy, and to claim back our faith and our right to express who we are, made in the image of God. Thank you.
Good morning, family. In 1952, the year after I was born, the American Psychiatric Association released their first diagnostic statistical manual on mental disorders. People such as myself were labelled perverts, deviants, psychotic, and sociopaths. In the same decade, the now infamous New South Wales Police Commissioner Colin Delaney, who I discovered in my research was a friend of my father's, declared that as the newly appointed police commissioner, he had two major goals. One was to reduce the road toll, and the second was to wipe homosexuality out of Sydney, which apparently had reached epidemic proportions. The awakening of my sexual orientation in my teens was frightening and confronting. Two things were very clear to me. Never tell a soul about your thoughts and feelings, and do everything possible to eradicate it. I tried everything to stop it. Nothing worked. In 1969, I became a born-again Christian, believing that God would somehow be the answer to my problem. Of course, this compounded the growing self-hatred and self-loathing. No longer was I just a pervert and a deviant, I was a sinner of the vilest kind, and unless I destroyed these filthy desires, I would spend eternity in hell. No matter how much I prayed, fasted, or had the demons of homosexuality and masturbation cast out of me, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviours persisted. In 1972, there were only two Christian programs in the world to cure people of homosexuality. One was in New York State, and the other was in the southern suburbs of Sydney. At the age of 21, believing this was my last resort, I admitted myself into the residential program, and it would take 1 to 2 years to make me straight. I had a minder watching over me all the day, items of clothing like my precious pink socks and my bikini underwear were removed as they were considered too gay. I was only allowed to do gender-specific tasks around the property. All this, along with much prayer and Bible reading, was meant to transform me. After 6 months, I couldn't take it anymore of the emotional and psychological abuse, and I left. It gets better. Fast forward to 2020. I was provided a cottage to live in during the pandemic in the Royal National Park south of Sydney. What I hadn't considered was that it was the same area as the conversion therapy program. Triggers were everywhere I went and looked, reminding me of some of the darkest days of my life. The property and church still existed. Through a series of synchronistic events, which would take too long to explain, I received a call from one of the leaders of the church who said, "Our church needs to become LGBTQ affirming. Can you help us with that?" There would not have been a more perfect person in Australia to help them. The organisation I founded, Ambassadors and Bridge Builders International, works with Christian churches, leaders, organisations to ensure they are genuinely affirming of LGBTQ people. You're so generous. I love you already. I tell churches that to do this properly will take 1 to 2 years to reduce polarisation and minimise harm. It begins with working with the leadership and progressively working down to the congregation to dispel myths and educate everyone on the lives and experiences of LGBTQ people. After stops and starts because of the pandemic, on Sunday, the 27th of March last year, a service was held where not only did the church announce it was officially totally affirming, they issued a personal apology to me and to others that have been harmed through the previous ignorance about sexual orientation and gender identity. This was, of course, a moving and profound moment. What was even more special to me was that we all walked out on the veranda of the property where I'd had my last encounter with the leader of the church. My sister and brother-in-law had come to rescue me. Before I could escape, she pulled me back and told my sister and brother-in-law that I was one of Sydney's worst homosexuals and continued to completely assassinate my character. Standing in the very same place, I took back my power, declared who I was not broken, I did not need fixing, I was loved, complete and whole. And you can watch that on YouTube if you want to. The LGBTQ community is well known for its resilience. But without hope, and dare I say without faith, there is no resilience. Hope and faith keep us going. The words of Paul in 1 Corinthians are true. Now these 3 things abide: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And of course, if you want to read the full story, it's available in my book, A Life of Unlearning. Thank you.
My name is Rabbi Yitzhak Ajzner. I'm talking to you from Israel, where it's 2 a.m. And I do my best to assist the religious LGBTQIA plus community as an Orthodox rabbi. I have some fantastic news and I have some terrible news. I'll start with the fantastic news. If I compare the number of Orthodox rabbis of any gender today who are prepared to advocate for LGBTQIA plus causes and the extent they are prepared to stick their necks out to the number and extent even 5 years ago, there is no question that today we are in a totally different ballpark. Things are changing. I myself am networked with over 100 rabbis in the context of this form of advocacy, and I can rely on their support to sign petitions and letters, attend events, and participate in activism. Now the terrible news. We are still the fringe of the fringe. I can find 100 supportive rabbis, but there are many thousands who are still shockingly antagonistic, many of them insisting on expressing themselves in the most hateful and abhorrent manner. But it is due to the fact that there are so few of us willing to be supportive that one finds oneself as a religious leader in situations where one is literally the only person on the planet who can help somebody, and one's impact can be so meaningful and profound. I would like to share with you one such incident in which I have had the privilege of taking a pivotal role to illustrate how keenly we need to be aware how each one of us can make an extraordinary difference. ABBI, not his real name, and I'll change some other details, lives in a part of Europe where it is very difficult to convert to Judaism. In this region, the rabbinic courts are particularly reluctant to accept non-Jews into the faith. For a transgender person like ABBI, to my profound shame and embarrassment, it's outright impossible. ABBI was actually brought up Jewish, went to synagogues, wore a Star of David. He always identified as Jewish, and consequently even suffered from anti-Semitism. At a relatively late age, he found out that he was not in fact religiously Jewish. While his father was Jewish and his mother's father was Jewish, his mother's mother was not a Jewess. And in Judaism, one's religion is determined via mothers. But ABBI was on a journey towards becoming a committed Jew and sought to be considered Jewish not only ethnically and socially, but legally, religiously. But no Orthodox court would consider his request. When ABBI eventually contacted me, it seemed there was nobody else who would assist. I was able to find, in fact, one unofficial but totally authentic Orthodox Jewish court in Israel who will perform conversions for LGBTQI plus people, and to ABBI's profound joy and relief, I was able to connect him to the head of this court and accompany him on a path to fulfilling his dream to becoming a Jew in line with his self-identity. And when I was told that one of the regular members of this special court would not participate and that I needed to replace him as there was nobody else, I had that privilege as well. LGBTQIA plus people of all religions must never be asked to choose between their religious identity and their gender or sexual or romantic attraction. And sadly, the very small minority of spiritual leaders who care for them must be keenly aware what a rare species we are and how crucial we often are to their journey. As Jewish tradition teaches, a person who saves one soul is considered as if they saved the entire world, for the value of each and every soul is infinite. In this spirit, I have managed to collect 75 rabbis from around the world to sign a document that declares that it is prohibited by Jewish law to refer anybody to conversion therapy. The plan is to publicize this document soon. I hope I can find a way to bring it to your attention when it comes out. If you find it helps advance your work, please consider giving it further publicity to maximize its influence and effect. It is vital, even life-saving, for all LGBTQIA plus people to know that their romantic or sexual inclination or their gender is not incompatible with Halacha, Jewish law, and that Jewish law is not exclusionary of any Jew, no matter what shade or hue of the rainbow they may be. I urge all LGBTQIA plus people who may be struggling to seek out one of the mushrooming spiritual support groups, or reach out to one of the ever-expanding assembly of compassionate religious leaders and join the community of countless religious LGBTQIA plus people who are enjoying a fully fulfilled life of equality, dignity, and love.